I woke up, as usual, at 7:30, quietly, steadily, without any unnecessary noise. The morning light filtered through the curtains, creating a soft, almost imperceptible shadow on the walls. I got out of bed, just as I had done 1,000 times before. I went to the kitchen, poured myself some coffee, and that moment, when the hot cup is in my hands and the aroma fills the space, had always been a symbol of calmness and stability for me. This was my morning, every morning, just like the one before. I worked as a designer at a trendy agency, and it seemed like there was nothing superfluous in my life. At the same time, in recent months, I found myself increasingly aware that something was wrong. Everything was in its place: work, home, stability, everything needed for happiness. And yet, I felt like I was standing in an empty room, unable to find the door that would lead to life. I continued going to work, smiling at meetings, but I felt that there was nothing real in it. Daniel, my husband, was perfect in his predictability. His life was as steady as an iron structure, immune to any tremors. He was a successful lawyer, with a career that knew no crises. We drank our morning coffee together, and in these calm, routine moments, I felt that something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Everything seemed fine. But at the same time, there was nothing. He was always there, and perhaps this was the problem. I began to feel more and more that we were both living according to a schedule, following a rhythm that had long become familiar to us. I cooked dinners, we watched TV, talked about trivial things, but I no longer felt anything except for superficial politeness. It was as if each of us was a stranger in our own place, but we didn't speak about it aloud. How could one complain about such a life? Stability, success, comfort. But there was no life in it. There were no feelings like I once had, when the world around seemed bright and full of possibilities. I didn't know what I needed to change to bring that feeling back. I only knew that if I didn't do it myself, one day I would wake up and realize that all I had done was simply waste time. And then, just at that moment, when I felt like something crucial was missing from my life, something happened that I had never expected. The doorbell shattered the morning silence like thunder on a clear day. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, washing my face, trying to collect my thoughts. My gaze didn't linger on any reflection. It was the same as always. Empty. As if I were looking at someone else's life, someone else's woman. When I approached the door, I immediately recognized him. Kelly. He was Daniel's older brother, and we hadn't seen each other in several years. He had always been a bit different. His life seemed chaotic, but in that unrest, there was a magnetism that drew people in. He was the kind of person who could drop everything and move to another place without a second thought. There was something elusive about him, something I had always tried to hide in myself. He stood in the doorway as if he were the owner of the house, not asking for permission. Taking off his shoes, he walked in without saying a word, except for "hi." Daniel didn't seem particularly happy to see him. He was friendly, but I could see how his face was slightly tense. It was strange. Daniel, who had always been so confident, suddenly seemed small next to Kelly. They clearly weren't close, and the tension was palpable. I didn't know how to react, but I still invited him for a cup of coffee. He settled into the chair with ease and started talking as if it had been only a day since we last saw each other. There was a certain audacity in his voice, the way he spoke, something that made me feel uncomfortable. I watched him, not knowing how to behave. Everything was familiar, but at the same time, alien. "So, how's everything here?" Kelly threw a glance at Daniel and smirked. "Feels like I'm looking at a picture from an ad catalog. Everything's perfect, as always." Daniel shivered, but remained silent. I noticed how his face became rigid, as if he were trying to hide something. We had no secrets, but something in Kelly's behavior made Daniel uncomfortable. I sat between them, feeling the air grow heavy. After dinner, Kelly unexpectedly grabbed my phone. He scrolled through my social media feed and suddenly said, "You could be something more than just what you show." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't a compliment, and I felt awkward. He simply observed me like an artist observing his model. It wasn't a challenge, but still, it touched something in me. I felt my heart start to beat faster, as if under the influence of some invisible force. With each of his looks, it became harder for me to breathe, as if I was becoming part of something I didn't understand. Time continued to stretch on, but something in the atmosphere of the house was changing. With each passing day, I felt as though everything around me began to lose its clarity, dissolving into dull shades. Daniel and I seemed to continue living, but it was becoming harder and harder to pretend with each passing day. Kelly, like an invisible storm, penetrated our space and stirred up more and more vague feelings within me that I couldn't explain. His presence became something inevitable. At first, it was the small details, a cup of coffee left on the table, which I would clean up without even noticing how it had become a habit. Yesterday, he had forgotten his keys, and I found them in the pocket of a coat hanging on the hook. Today, he didn't ask permission before taking my phone and scrolling through my social media photos. Little things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too deliberate. Kelly spoke about his art with such confidence, as if the world were his canvas and Daniel and I were merely the backdrop for his bold strokes. He began staying with us for dinner more often, without asking, initiating conversations that made me feel as though I had suddenly found myself at the center of something important, yet completely foreign. He started asking me strange questions, ones that we never used to discuss with Daniel. One evening, as we sat at dinner and I, as usual, tried to keep the conversation going, Kelly asked me, "Have you ever thought about what it means to be yourself?" I froze, not knowing how to respond. The question was simple, but it carried so many layers that I couldn't take hold of any one part without unraveling everything else. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying not to betray my unease. "I mean," he continued, "you've always been around, but you've never been at the center. You've gotten so used to being in the background that you don't even notice it." That was too much. How could he have noticed that? How could he know something I hadn't even admitted to myself? I felt everything inside me tighten, and a fire of shame flared up that I couldn't extinguish. Daniel remained silent, as he always did in moments like these. His silence was a shield, but to me, it felt alienating. He sat across from me, but I felt as if he couldn't see me at all. It was as if I were dissolving, becoming part of some empty, mechanical process. We were two people sitting at the same table, yet so far apart. That evening ended like all the others, and we went to our rooms. I walked to my bedroom, but my thoughts stayed somewhere in between. I thought about Kelly's words, about how they had barged into my life and disrupted its calm. It was as if they had opened a door to a world I had long blocked off from myself. When I found myself alone in front of the mirror, I suddenly felt that I no longer knew who was looking back at me. My reflection seemed strange, blurry, as if I were someone else. The question Kelly had asked me about what it means to be yourself lingered with me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I tried to find an answer, but instead, I just sat there, staring at my reflection, searching for something that had never existed. That evening, Kelly offered to let me help with his art project. I didn't know why I agreed. Perhaps it was simply a desire for something new, something that could pull me out of this frozen life, but I didn't think it would turn out the way it did. He asked me to meet him in the living room, where he was assembling a strange composition of mirrors, antique items, and undefined objects that looked like torn pieces of someone's life. The space felt lost, disoriented. Each mirror was pointed in a different direction, creating a chaotic reflection of everything I had ever known. I sat in the center of this chaos, on a chair, surrounded by odd objects. Kelly told me that he needed me to become part of his project, part of this visual and conceptual nonsense, as if dissolving into it. I couldn't refuse. At first I felt uncomfortable, but with each passing minute, sitting in this strange and unusual space, something inside me began to change. He spoke about the perception of reality, about how we hide our true feelings behind a facade. It all sounded intelligent and pretentious, and I probably shouldn't have taken his words so personally, but I couldn't stop thinking that he had seen something in me that I had long tried to hide. Then he asked me how I managed to conceal my inner emptiness. In his eyes was such confidence, as if he were the kind of person who always knows the answer, even if he hasn't found it himself. His words pierced through me like needles, causing pain that I hadn't realized until I heard them. I tried to distract myself, but I couldn't. And then, when he was photographing me, something happened. I felt my hand instinctively reach toward his face, and suddenly, I kissed him. When it was all over, I sat before him, not knowing how to behave, how to return to normalcy. There was something indescribable in Kelly's eyes, not surprise, not judgment, but just something strange, elusive. I stood up, not saying a word, and went to my bedroom. Closing the door behind me, I stayed in the darkness, trying to understand what I had done and what I was supposed to do with it now. That evening, as Daniel and I were sitting at dinner, I noticed how he was looking at me. It was a gaze that I couldn't ignore. It felt so distant, as if I were far away, even though I was sitting right in front of him. His eyes lacked that familiar interest he used to show me, even in the most ordinary conversations. I tried to say something, to tell him about how my day went, but the words got stuck in my throat. He, as always, listened, but his attention was somewhere far away. He didn't see me, not the way he used to. I tried to understand when it all changed. When exactly did I stop being the woman he shared his life with? And what had changed in me that made me feel like I no longer belonged to this house, this life? But instead of answers, all I heard in my head were echoes of questions that seemed to destroy everything that once felt stable. "Are you feeling okay?" Daniel asked, a little reserved. "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, but my voice sounded empty. After dinner, I couldn't stay in the house. I went outside aimlessly, just to breathe. It was a cold evening, but the air felt alive to me. I wandered the streets as if searching for something, maybe for myself. When I came back, Kelly was there in the living room with a cup of coffee in his hands. It seemed like he had been waiting for me. "You stayed out too long," he said with a barely noticeable smile. "You still have time to think about what you really want, about who you are." I couldn't respond. His words were penetrating, making me think about everything I had been avoiding. He saw what I had been hiding. He saw my inner turmoil. And in his gaze, there was something that made me feel exposed. I couldn't hide what was happening inside me any longer. Kelly was pushing me toward this thought. He was opening the doors to my own fears and dissatisfaction, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. "What's happening to you? Who are you, really? What do you need?" I didn't know, but I felt that I was approaching the moment when I would have to choose. It was the moment when I had to understand what I needed from life and what I needed to leave behind. Each day, the world around me became more and more unrecognizable. We continued to live as we always had, but now everything seemed distorted, as if we were existing in a parallel reality where everything that was happening made no sense. I tried to return to my old life, but my efforts seemed futile. It was as if I were trying to put on an old dress that no longer fit. Daniel more and more often avoided my gaze, and I felt that a chasm was growing between us, one that couldn't be filled. We sat at dinner, both absorbed in our own thoughts, but no one dared to speak about what was really happening. He spoke about his work, and I about what had happened at the agency, but our words no longer carried meaning. I noticed how he looked at me, as if he saw me but didn't understand. It was a strange feeling to be with someone who had once known every thought, every reaction of mine, and now seemed to be in a different world. "You're acting strange," he said once at dinner, his voice tinged with hidden concern. I nodded, not knowing what to say. I couldn't tell him that every day I felt an emptiness inside, that I no longer knew who I was or what was happening in my life. I couldn't tell him about Kelly, how his words and actions had started changing the way I saw the world. I couldn't admit that the kiss with Kelly wasn't an accident. It was something more than just an impulse. It was a sign that something inside me had broken. And Kelly. With him, everything was becoming more complicated. His questions never stopped, and each one seemed to tear me apart. He kept finding the weak spots, opening up corners that I had so carefully hidden. By then, I could no longer hide how deeply he affected me. I tried to fight it, to distance myself, but every time his gaze met mine, I lost control again. "You were never real, were you?" he once said, when we found ourselves alone again. We were sitting in his studio, surrounded by those same strange objects and mirrors. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. He had hit the mark again. I wasn't real. I had become what others wanted to see, what I was supposed to be, and now it was hard to find my way back. I didn't know what to do. Everything in my life had become unrecognizable, and I didn't know how to escape. I had lost myself, but what was worse, I began to fear who I might become. One day, when Kelly and I met at a cafe to discuss another project, he suddenly started talking about his family. His tone was unusual, as if he was trying to reveal something to me, but at the same time, he was concealing it. He spoke without hesitation, as if this information were the most ordinary thing in the world. I sat across from him, listening to his voice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to lead me to some new level of understanding, and perhaps destroy everything I had believed in. "You know your husband isn't quite what he seems," Kelly said, as if this were an obvious fact. "Have you ever wondered what's really hidden behind Daniel's mask?" he continued. "You know he's not always so perfect, and his family, it's not exactly what they want it to be." He told me how he had accidentally come across documents that revealed his father had been involved in some financial schemes. Daniel didn't know about this. He knew nothing about the hidden deals, fake contracts, and forgeries that could destroy the reputation of his entire family. I sat in silence, absorbed by these revelations. Kelly's words hit me like a slap in the face, but I couldn't turn away. I couldn't stop thinking that everything I had known about Daniel was suddenly in question. "You didn't think everything could be so perfect, did you?" Kelly continued, his voice soft but certain. "He may seem successful, stable, but you don't know everything. And when you start to see him for who he really is, it will be hard to go back." I felt something crumble inside me. What had seemed so absolutely clear now became fragile and blurry. All those years I had spent with Daniel were starting to lose their clarity. I looked at him and suddenly realized that everything he was saying was forcing me to see my life from a different perspective. I stood up and, without saying a word, left the cafe. My gaze remained vacant, and inside I felt every belief I had starting to fall apart, as if it had been built on sand. I didn't know what to do with this new knowledge. The time I spent trying to piece myself together after the revelations turned out to be the hardest. Not because I didn't know what to do. On the contrary, I already understood that I couldn't continue living in these relationships, which had become an illusion. I could no longer hide behind the mask I had worn for myself and for Daniel. Everything I had once considered right now seemed artificial. I began to see the world and my life as they were, not as I had wanted them to be. A few days passed, and with each one I felt the rift between Daniel and me growing more noticeable. We were no longer partners, no longer close. We were two people living in the same house, but their worlds no longer intersected. And when he first spoke about trying to fix our relationship, I realized that I could no longer do it. I didn't know who I was anymore, but I knew for certain that I couldn't return to this comfortable yet empty world. That evening, when I sat before him again, I saw his eyes. He was searching for me, but he could no longer find me. He was still the person I once needed, but not the person I needed now. His question about what was happening to us seemed to pull me out of my helplessness. I looked at him, and it was a strange feeling, as though, despite all his stability, he was part of the very lie I had so long built around myself. I could no longer look at him and say that everything would be fine. I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. And then, standing before him, I said, "I can't keep living like this. This is no longer my life." Daniel fell silent, but I saw how his eyes filled with pain. He didn't understand, couldn't understand what was happening to us, but I knew that for me, it was all over. I couldn't stay in a relationship that had become empty. I couldn't continue living a life that wasn't mine. I took my things. There was no scandal, no hysteria. just the cold, clear realization that I couldn't stay here anymore. I walked into the empty night, not knowing where to go, but for the first time, I felt like I was stepping in the right direction. There was something new in that step, something alive, and I understood that I couldn't keep hiding behind the roles that had been imposed on me. A few days later, I found myself at an exhibition in an art gallery. It was by chance I just wandered in, as if by instinct. The halls were empty, the light fell softly and peacefully, and I walked among paintings and photographs, not knowing what I was looking for. And then, among the many images, I stopped. On one of the walls hung a photograph. It was my portrait, but it wasn't me. In this image, there was something unimaginably familiar and frightening. I saw my vulnerability in it, my fear, the tears I had hidden for years. I saw the woman I had tried not to notice.